Now that we've taken our first look at relative feature lines, we'll try using them in a practical example. In this session, we'll use relative feature lines to control the pavement grading of a proposed parking lot. As you can see, I've got a drawing open on screen. We are viewing the drawing in two different views. On the left, we can see a top view of the geometry, and over here on the right, we are viewing the geometry using a southeast isometric view, such that we can see the elevational differences. I'm going to come back over to the left. We'll do a quick tour. I started this drawing by creating a feature line. You can see this feature line is at elevation, and it was drawn with a negative 2% slope heading to the west. I then created a stepped offset of this feature line at negative 2%, and then I did a stepped offset upward at 2%, then down, and then up. These feature lines were used to define this surface, called design surface. If I select that and bring up the object viewer, I can orbit this, and we can get an idea of what that surface looks like. Let me close the object viewer, and I'll press escape. This surface represents the overall grading intent for my parking lot. Generally speaking, as the stormwater hits the pavement, it's going to drain to the middle, and then it will drain to the west. Chances are I will have an inlet right here and right here. Notice I have also created some polylines defining the edge of pavement of my parking lot, both the outside edge and the island. If we look over to the right, you can see that I've also copied some of my brake line geometry from that design surface. We'll be using these entities in a little bit. Let me come back over to the left. I'd like to start by converting my edge of pavement geometry into feature lines, and then I'll project those up to that design surface. To do that, here on the Home tab, I'll go to the Create Design panel. I'll open the Feature Line menu, and I'll choose Create Feature Lines from Objects. I will select the edge of pavement polylines, and I'll press Enter. I'm not going to be leveraging a site in this case. I'm not going to name the objects. I am going to change their style. Let me open the menu and I'll choose the edge of pavement feature line style. I'd like to erase these existing objects and I'd like to assign elevations. Let me click OK. I'd like the elevations assigned from the design surface. We'll insert the intermediate grade breakpoints, and I'd like these entities to be relative to that design surface at elevation 0. Let me click OK. At this point, you can see that that geometry has been projected up to meet that surface. Likewise, these feature lines are relative to the surface, so if my surface were to change, these feature lines will update as well. Let's press Ctrl-Z to put things back the way they were, and we'll take the concept a little further. Now that I have these relative feature lines, let's use them to build a 3D corridor model of this parking lot. If we look down in the lower right, you can see that I've created an assembly, and that assembly has a single curb and gutter object on it. I'm going to sweep this curb and gutter around the feature lines to define the curb and gutter geometry. To build the corridor, I'll come up to the Create Design panel and I'll click the Corridor button. I will then select one of my feature lines, and since I'm using this as a corridor baseline, I have to give it a name. I'm going to call this Lot EOP, and I'll click OK. I will then give my corridor a name. I'll call this Parking Lot. We'll be using a feature line as the baseline. We'll be using that Lot EOP feature line. For the assembly, I'll select that curb and gutter assembly we just looked at. I'm not going to be targeting a surface just yet. I would like to set baseline and region parameters though, so we'll leave this checked and I'll click OK. In the dialog box, I'm going to click the Set All Frequencies button, and then for along curves, I'm going to change this to by curvature, and I'll set the mid-ordinate distance to 0.1. I do this to tighten up the assembly insertions as we go around curves, something that I definitely have in my island geometry. When I'm finished, I'll come down and click OK, and then I'll click OK, and we'll rebuild the corridor. Next, we'll add the island. I'll do that by selecting my corridor. I'll go to Corridor Properties, Parameters. We'll add a baseline. I'd like to add a feature line, and I'll click this green block. This allows me to select the feature line from screen. I'll choose the island, and then we'll give this a name. I'll call this Lot Island, and I'll click OK. And OK. Once that baseline has been added, I'll right-click and choose Add Region, and then we'll select the curb and gutter assembly. I'll click OK, and OK, and we'll rebuild. Now at this point, my corridor is being displayed using a plottable style. Let's change that. I'll do that by coming over to the Properties palette, and I'll drag this to the bottom, and I'll change the code set style to Working. Now the corridor is still selected. I'm going to choose the object viewer, and then I'll click the southeast hotspot on the view cube a couple times to center the model on screen. I'll roll the mouse wheel forward, and as I orbit, you can see not only do we have dynamic pavement grades, we now have dynamic curb and gutter as well. I'm going to close the object viewer, and I'll press Escape. At this point, I'll come over to the Prospector tab, and we'll come down to the Corridors group. Let me open this up. I'll right-click on my new corridor, and I'll set the Rebuild to Automatic. Now that we have our curb and gutter finished, we'll build a surface. I'm going to start by hiding this design surface. I don't need to see this right now. I'll do that by selecting it, and in the Properties palette, I will change its style to No Display. Then we'll build our corridor surface. We'll do that by selecting the corridor, and in the contextual ribbon, I'll choose Corridor Surfaces. I'd like to create a new surface. We'll call this Lot Top. For the surface style, I'm going to choose Contours and Triangles, so we can see both of those components. And then the data I'd like to use for this surface will be feature lines. We'll leverage the back of curb feature line. I'll add the flange, also considered the edge of pavement. We'll add the flow line of gutter and the top of curb. I'll come down and click OK. Once the surface is built, I'll select it and we'll bring it up in the object viewer. Let me spin this around, and you can see that we have nice definition in the curb and gutter geometry. However, the grading in these middle areas is incorrect. That being said, I expect that because I haven't added the break lines just yet. Currently, we are simply triangulating from edge of pavement to edge of pavement. Let's fix that. I'm going to close the object viewer. I'll press Escape to deselect. Let's come back over to this view on the right. If you remember, I created these additional break line objects earlier. Let's convert these into feature lines and we'll project these up to meet the design surface. Once again, we'll come back to the Create Design panel. I'll open the Feature Line menu and I'll choose Create Feature Lines from Objects. I'll select these objects and press Enter. No site, not going to name them. For style, I'm going to use Grading Edge. We'll erase the objects and we'll assign elevations. Let me click OK. I'll assign the elevations from the design surface. We'll insert the intermediate grade break points, and I'd like these break lines to be relative to that surface at elevation 0. Let's click OK. At this point, I now have break lines that are dynamic to that design surface. Let's add them to the parking lot surface. I'll do that by selecting one of them. I'll right-click, and then I'll come down and choose Select Similar. I apologize, that's off screen. Once they're selected, I'll come up to the contextual ribbon, and I'll choose Add to Surface as break line. We will add these to our parking lot surface, and I'll click OK. Now, since these break lines represent a long stretch, I am going to add some vertices. So I'll select the distance option within the supplementing factors, and I'll set my maximum triangle length to 15 feet. I'll click OK. I will then press Escape to deselect. Let's choose the surface. We'll go to Object Viewer, and we'll take a look at this in 3D. As you can see, in addition to the nicely modeled curb and gutter, the entire pavement area now matches the intent of our design surface. When I'm finished reviewing the surface, we'll go ahead and close the object viewer. Now the surface is still selected. Let's push this to the back. I'll do that by right-clicking. I'll come down to Display Order, and I'll choose Send to Back. So at this point, not only do we have a nicely modeled parking lot, that parking lot model is also dynamically linked to that design surface. So if I was to edit that design surface by dragging some of these defining feature lines up and down, you can see how the entire parking lot model updates automatically. So in this case, I used relative feature lines to create a parking lot that automatically reacts when changes are made to a design surface. Now this is just one example. With a little experimentation and practice, relative feature lines can be used to add a dynamic component to many of your design tasks. Would you like to explore other Autodesk infrastructure ideas and workflows? If so, please visit the Civil Immersion blog by scanning the QR code or by following the URL listed below.